Hey guys, today we're in feudal Japan, centuries before modern Tokyo, before neon lights and bullet trains. The Japan of samurai wasn't the place you've seen in movies where honor glows like polished steel and cherry blossoms drift through every scene. It was a world built on discipline so complete that it shaped every waking moment, and even the hours of sleep. If you could step into that world now, if you could live even one full day as a samurai actually lived, the weight of it would be immediate and unrelenting. The darkness before dawn in a samurai household was complete. No streetlights existed, no glow from distant windows, no ambient light bleeding in from anywhere. Just blackness so thick you couldn't see your own hand. And in that darkness, samurai were already awake. Not because something woke them, but because waking before dawn was simply what you did. The day began in darkness, every day, without exception. Most people in feudal Japan rose with the sun, or shortly after. Farmers waited for enough light to see their fields. Merchants opened shops when customers could see their wares. But samurai operated on a different schedule. Pre-dawn meditation was fundamental, a practice so ingrained that not doing it would feel as strange as not breathing. You woke in complete darkness, perhaps 2 hours before sunrise, and you sat in silence with your thoughts about ending. The meditation practice had a specific focus. Not peace, not emptiness, not spiritual transcendence. The focus was on your own passing. You visualized it in detail. Your body still, breath stopped, the transition from living to not living. This wasn't metaphorical contemplation. It was practical preparation. Samurai faced situations where that transition might come suddenly, and the daily practice was meant to remove the fear and shock from it. Familiarize yourself with the idea until it becomes ordinary. Strip away the mystery. Make it as unremarkable as putting on clothes or eating rice. The position for this meditation was formal. Kneeling, weight resting on your heels, back perfectly straight, hands placed on your thighs. The position itself was called Caesar, and it was how you sat for everything formal. Your body learned this position so thoroughly that it became automatic. Even now, centuries later, the position remains a mark of Japanese formality, though the original intensity has softened. In the darkness, maintaining this position for an hour or more, your body reported various discomforts. Knees began to ache after 20 minutes. The ache built gradually, becoming a dull pressure that spread through the joint. By 40 minutes, the pressure was constant and significant. Your ankles protested the angle they were held in. Your lower back reminded you it was supporting your full upright posture without the relief of shifting or slouching. These sensations were part of the practice, not something to fight or suppress, but something to acknowledge without reacting. Pain is information. The mind observes the body's reports without letting those reports control action. The room where you meditated was small and sparse. Tatami mats covered the floor, their woven straw surface firm beneath you. The smell of the mats, grassy and slightly dry, mixed with old wood and the faint trace of incense from the household shrine. The walls were paper screens in wooden frames, shoji, which provided almost no insulation from cold or sound. In winter, you could see your breath in the darkness. In summer, the humidity made everything feel damp. Neither condition changed the routine. You sat in darkness regardless of temperature, regardless of comfort, because this was simply when the day began. The meditation wasn't solitary by accident. Other members of the household were doing the same thing in other rooms. Your father in his space, older brothers in theirs, even young children once they reached the age of training. The household woke in darkness together, each person sitting alone but parallel to the others. No one spoke during these hours. The silence was absolute except for the sounds of breathing and the occasional creak of the old wooden house settling. Thoughts during meditation wandered despite the formal focus. The human mind resists single-pointed attention, especially in darkness when there's nothing external to anchor it. You begin with the visualization of your own passing, but then thoughts would drift. Concerns about the day ahead, memories from yesterday, physical discomfort pulling attention away from the intended focus. This was normal. The practice wasn't to achieve perfect focus, but to keep returning attention to the intended point whenever it wandered. Over and over, through the full hour or more of sitting, you'd notice your mind had wandered and you'd bring it back. The purpose of this daily practice became clearer after years of repetition. It wasn't about morbid obsession or death worship. It was about reducing the power that fear of ending held over your decisions. If you spent time each day facing that fear directly, examining it, familiarizing yourself with it, then when actual danger arrived, the fear response was dampened, not eliminated. Fear never truly disappears, but made more manageable. You could act deliberately instead of freezing or panicking. This was considered essential for warriors who might face life-threatening situations where split-second decisions mattered. As the darkness very gradually began to thin, shifting from complete black to the barest suggestion of deep grey, the meditation period came to its natural end. You couldn't see this change, not really, but you felt it somehow. Perhaps a subtle shift in temperature as the earth began its slow turn toward the sun. Perhaps the first bird sounds, tentative calls testing whether dawn was approaching. The hour of meditation was ending, and the day's activities could begin. Rising from Caesar after an hour of kneeling required care. Your legs were asleep, circulation reduced, nerves compressed. Standing too quickly would send sharp tingling through your feet and risk stumbling. So, you shifted your weight slowly, rolled to one side, straightened your legs gradually, flexed your feet to restore feeling. This transition took a minute or two. By the time you stood fully, your legs would support you again, though they'd ache for several minutes more. The first task after meditation was preparing yourself for the day. This involved specific steps performed in a specific order, not because someone was watching and would punish deviation, but because the routine itself was the point. Discipline expressed through small, repeated actions, each morning identical to the one before and the one that would follow. Water for washing was kept in a small basin. In winter, this water was cold enough to shock when it touched your skin. In summer, it was merely cool, offering brief relief from humidity. You dipped your hands, brought water to your face, felt the immediate alertness that cold water brings. Washing was thorough but quick. Face, neck, hands, forearms. The water turned slightly grey from night's accumulation of dust and oil. You dried with a rough cotton cloth, its texture coarse against skin, then hung the cloth precisely where it always hung. Dressing required attention to detail because the clothing had multiple layers and each layer had to be arranged correctly. First came the fundoshi, a length of cloth wrapped around the hips in a specific pattern. The wrapping technique was precise, creating support while allowing movement. Over this came the hadagi, an underrobe of cotton, or sometimes silk if you came from wealthy family. The hadagi was tied closed, always left side over right. Right over left was how the deceased were dressed, and reversing this by accident would be noticed and corrected immediately. The outer kimono came next, a more formal garment that marked your status. The fabric's quality, the subtlety or boldness of its pattern, the way it was worn, all of these communicated information about your family's standing and your own position within the samurai class. This too was wrapped left over right and secured with an obi, a wide belt that wrapped around the waist multiple times and tied in back. The obi served functional purposes, providing support for your back during physical activity and creating a place where your swords would rest. The hakama, wide-legged trousers that were distinctive to samurai, came last. These were pleated carefully, 7 pleats total, 5 in front and 2 in back. Each pleat had symbolic meaning, though by this period in history those meanings were more tradition than active philosophy. The hakama was tied at the waist, adjusted so it hung at the correct length, then the pleats were smoothed and straightened. The entire dressing process took 10 to 15 minutes when done properly. You'd done it thousands of times. Your hands knew the movements without thought. By the time you finished dressing, the darkness had thinned enough that you could see the room's basic shapes. Not clearly, but enough to distinguish the sword stand from the small chest, the sleeping mat rolled in the corner from the empty floor space. The house was beginning to stir with small sounds. Footsteps in another room, the soft slide of a door opening, quiet movements that indicated others were also preparing for the day. The swords required attention before anything else. They rested on a wooden stand, positioned horizontally with the blades facing upward. This orientation kept the edge from dulling against the scabbard. The katana, the longer sword, rested above the wakizashi, the shorter companion blade. Together, these two swords marked you as samurai. They weren't decorative. They were working tools and symbols of your entire social class, and they required daily care regardless of whether they'd been used. You approached the sword stand with a slight bow. a gesture so automatic it was almost unconscious. Then you took the katana, drew it smoothly from its scabbard, and examined the blade in the growing light. The steel caught what little illumination existed, revealing the hamon, the temper line that ran along the edge where hard steel met softer spine. This line was unique to each blade, as distinctive as a fingerprint. You'd looked at this particular pattern so many times you could draw it from memory. The blade showed no rust, no spots, no damage. This was good. Rust on a blade was a mark of shame, evidence that you'd neglected your responsibilities. Even a day without proper cleaning could start oxidation, and once rust took hold, it damaged the steel permanently. So every morning you cleaned blades that didn't look dirty, maintaining them against threats that couldn't be seen yet. The cleaning cloth was soft cotton, kept specifically for sword care. You wiped the blade from base to tip, following the spine first, then the edge, always moving away from your body. The motion was smooth and practiced, the cloth making almost no sound against the steel. After wiping came the oil, choji oil, mixed with clove for preservation. You applied the barest amount, spreading it evenly along the entire blade. Too much oil would attract dust and eventually cause problems. Too little would leave the steel vulnerable to moisture in the air. The scabbard required inspection as well. You checked the opening for rough spots that might scratch the blade during drawing or sheathing. You examined the cord that wrapped the scabbard, making sure it was secure and not fraying. You verified that the small knife in the scabbard's side pocket was present and secure. Everything had to be correct because these were your primary tools. In a time when your safety might depend on drawing a sword in an instant, malfunctions weren't acceptable. After the katana, you repeated the entire process with the wakizashi. This shorter blade was equally important, perhaps more so because it never left your side. The katana might be left at a doorway when entering certain buildings, but the wakizashi stayed with you always. It was the blade used for close fighting, for indoor spaces, and for the ritual ending that every samurai had to be prepared to perform if circumstances required it. The maintenance of both blades took roughly 30 minutes. This time could have been shortened, but speed wasn't the point. The care and attention themselves were the point. The deliberate focus on a practical task, the repetition of movements done the same way every morning. This was meditation expressed through action rather than stillness. By the time sword maintenance was complete, the house was fully awake. You could hear your mother's voice giving quiet instructions to servants, your younger siblings moving around in their rooms, your father's footsteps as he walked through the corridor. The smell of morning rice cooking reached you from the kitchen area. The household was preparing for the day's first meal, which would be eaten in formal silence before anyone left for their duties. You slid both swords through your obi, the katana on your left hip, with the edge facing upward, the wakizashi positioned slightly forward of it at a different angle. The weight was familiar, comforting in a strange way. You were never fully dressed without your swords. Being without them would feel like missing a limb, an absence so obvious it would make you vulnerable and incomplete. The family gathered for breakfast in the main room. Everyone knelt in their assigned positions, a hierarchy that reflected age and status. Your father at the head, your mother to his left, older siblings in order of age, younger ones farther from the center. Servants brought trays with the morning meal, rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, sometimes a small piece of grilled fish. The portions were modest. Samurai culture emphasized restraint in eating, considering large meals and obvious enjoyment of food to be signs of weak character. No one spoke during the meal. Eating was done with full attention to the food itself. You picked up rice with chopsticks, brought it to your mouth, chewed thoroughly, swallowed. The taste was familiar to the point of being almost unnoticeable. Rice every morning, usually the same type, prepared the same way. The miso soup was warm and salty. The pickles provided sharp contrast. The fish, when present, offered brief variation in texture and flavor. But the meal wasn't about enjoyment. It was about fuel for the body, consumed with gratitude and without complaint. Your father finished first, as he always did. He set down his chopsticks with a quiet click, placed his hands briefly together in acknowledgement of the meal, then stood. Everyone else remained kneeling until he left the room. Only after his departure did the rest of the family finish eating at their own pace. This hierarchy was so deeply embedded that no one thought about it. It was simply the order of things, as natural as the sun rising. After breakfast, you returned to your room briefly to collect what you'd need for the day. If training was scheduled, you'd bring nothing. Your body and weapons were sufficient. If you had duties at your lord's residence, you might need writing materials or specific clothing. The day's requirements varied, but the morning routine remained constant. Wake in darkness, meditate, prepare yourself, maintain your weapons, eat in silence, then move into whatever the day required. Samurai training began long before you could truly understand what it meant. At 5 years old, perhaps younger in some families, the transformation started. Not with swords or combat, but with posture, with silence, with learning to control your face and voice. Children in samurai families were not allowed the unrestrained emotional expression that other children experienced. Crying was discouraged to the point of punishment. Showing fear was corrected immediately. Laughing too loudly brought reprimand. The training in emotional control began before the physical training because the mental discipline was considered more fundamental. The first weapon was wooden, a bokken shaped like a katana but carved from a single piece of oak. This training sword was given with ceremony, a moment treated as significant transition. You were no longer merely a child of a samurai family. You were beginning the path toward becoming samurai yourself. The bokken was heavy, far heavier than a 5-year-old could manage comfortably. Your hands couldn't grip it correctly because they were too small. When you tried to hold it in the proper position, extended in front of you, the tip immediately dropped toward the ground. Your arms lacked the strength to maintain the position. The initial training consisted almost entirely of building this basic strength. Hold the bokken extended. Hold it until your arms shook, until the burning sensation in your shoulders became overwhelming, until you were certain you couldn't hold it any longer. Then hold it for another count of 10. This was repeated daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Progress was measured in seconds. 1 week you could hold the position for 1 minute. 2 weeks later, perhaps 90 seconds. Months passed before you could hold it for 5 minutes without the tip wavering. No one praised you during this process. Instructors observed, corrected your grip or stance when they drifted from proper form, but offered no encouragement or acknowledgement of improvement. The work itself was the reward. Being able to do today what you couldn't do yesterday was sufficient motivation. External validation wasn't part of the system. You learned to measure yourself against your own previous performance, not against others' opinions. Falls were taught early because falling was inevitable. You were shown how to tuck, how to roll, how to distribute impact across larger areas of your body rather than concentrating it on vulnerable points. The practice was done on mats initially, then on harder surfaces. Forward rolls, backward rolls, side falls, learning to protect your head and not break your wrists by bracing incorrectly. This training was practical. During weapons practice, you'd be knocked down, tripped, pushed off balance. Knowing how to fall without injury was essential. Around age 7 or 8, training intensified. The wooden bokken was supplemented with other weapons, a practice spear, simply a long pole with a blunted end, a wooden knife for close-range drills. Training expanded from pure strength building into actual techniques. Not free-form fighting, but kata, predetermined sequences of movements that represented combat scenarios. Each kata was taught slowly, broken into individual movements. The instructor would demonstrate once at normal speed, then slow it down to show each step. Your first step here, weight shifts to front foot. Blade comes up at this angle. Turn the hips, not just the arms. Step forward with the opposite foot. Cut downward following this arc. Return to starting position. Each movement was practiced individually until it was correct. Then the sequence was put together. Once you could perform the sequence smoothly, you did it again and again. Repetition was the core method. Do it 100 times. Do it 1,000 times. Do it until your body performs it without your conscious mind directing it. The dojo where training occurred was a simple structure. Wooden floor, bare walls, weapons stored along one side. No decoration, no comfort, nothing to distract attention from practice. The space was cold in winter and stifling in summer. Training occurred regardless of temperature. You wore minimal clothing, traditional hakama, and sometimes an upper giai, but often just the hakama. bare feet on wooden floors. The space smelled of wood and sweat, old sweat worked into the floorboards and fresh sweat from the current session. Training sessions lasted for hours. In the beginning, perhaps 2 hours in the morning. As you grew older and your body adapted, sessions extended. 3 hours in the morning, a break for the midday meal, then another 2 hours in the afternoon. By your teenage years, training occupied most of your waking hours. Morning session, afternoon session, evening practice of kata and meditation. The intensity never decreased. If anything, it increased as you progressed, because higher skill required more refinement, and refinement required more repetition. Pain was constant, but not discussed. Your hands developed calluses from gripping weapons, thick ridges of toughened skin across your palms and the base of your fingers. These calluses would crack sometimes, especially in dry winter air, creating painful splits that made gripping weapons difficult. You learned to ignore this. The practice continued whether your hands hurt or not. Your shoulders carried chronic ache from the repetitive overhead motions. Your knees, already stressed from hours of formal kneeling, were further taxed by the constant footwork, the rapid direction changes, the low stances that were held until your legs trembled. All of this was considered normal. No one would ask if you were in pain, because the answer was obviously yes, and the question itself was irrelevant. Injuries occurred regularly. A training partner's strike landing wrong and giving you a deep bruise across your ribs that made breathing painful for a week. Rolling incorrectly and hyperextending a finger. Twisting an ankle during footwork drills. These were treated minimally, usually with cold water and pressure, then training continued. Broken bones were the threshold for stopping practice, and even then, only the affected limb would rest. A broken left arm meant you practiced right-handed techniques. A foot injury meant you focused on upper body work. Complete rest was almost never prescribed, unless the injury was severe enough to risk permanent damage. The mental aspect of training was equally demanding. You were expected to memorize not just physical techniques, but the philosophy behind them. Why this stance was stronger than that one. Why this angle of cut was more effective. The principles of distance, timing, and leverage. These weren't taught as abstract concepts, but as practical knowledge tied to physical practice. After performing a kata, your instructor might stop you and ask why you stepped to that particular spot. You needed to articulate the strategic reason, not just demonstrate the movement. Observation skills were trained specifically. You practiced watching an opponent's shoulders and hips rather than their weapon, because the body telegraphed movement before the weapon moved. You learned to track multiple people simultaneously, maintaining awareness of threats from different directions. You practiced fighting with restricted vision, a blindfold or eyes half closed, relying on sound and spatial awareness. These exercises felt artificial at the time, but their purpose was clear. Combat rarely happened in ideal conditions. Training in imperfect conditions prepared you for reality. Around age 12 or 13, real blades were introduced. Not full-length katana yet, but the wakizashi, the shorter sword that you could actually handle at that size. The first time you held real steel, the weight and balance were immediately different from wood. The blade felt alive in a way wood never did. The edge, even when not yet sharpened to its full keenness, was sharp enough to cut if handled carelessly. This added gravity to every movement. Mistakes with wooden swords left bruises. Mistakes with steel could mean permanent injury or worse. The transition to real weapons changed the emotional quality of training. Every action now carried genuine risk. Carelessness could result in cutting yourself or a training partner. This created a heightened focus that wooden weapons never quite achieved. Your mind couldn't wander even slightly because distraction could have immediate serious consequences. This was intentional. The real blade taught attention in a way that no amount of verbal instruction could match. Weapons maintenance became your responsibility once you had a real blade. Each evening after training you cleaned your sword thoroughly. Even though you hadn't used it in actual combat, hadn't cut anything, it still required cleaning. Sweat from your hands, moisture from the air, these posed constant threats to the steel. You wiped the blade completely clean, applied fresh oil, checked the edge for any imperfections, examined the handle wrapping, verified that the blade sat securely in the handle. This routine took 20 minutes each evening, and it was never skipped. The rhythm of training life was relentless. Wake before dawn, meditate, prepare yourself, eat in silence, train for hours, eat more, perform evening maintenance on weapons, meditate before sleep, or the schedule varied minimally between days. Perhaps one day emphasized archery while another focused on close combat, but the overall structure remained constant. This repetition was the point. Your life was shaped into a routine so regular that deviation felt wrong. The discipline wasn't imposed from outside after a while. It became internal, automatic. You woke before dawn, not because someone made you, but because that's what your body did now. You practiced kata, not because you were told to, but because not practicing would feel incomplete. By age 15 or 16, you were competent in multiple weapon systems: sword, spear, bow, and unarmed combat. Not a master, competence took decades, but capable of performing all basic and intermediate techniques correctly. You could hold your own in supervised training matches against adults. Your body had adapted to the physical demands, developing the specific conditioning that samurai training required. Your shoulders were broad and strong from years of sword work. Your legs were powerful from stance training and footwork. Your hands were tough, and your reflexes were sharp from thousands of hours of practice. But the training never ended. There was no graduation, no moment where someone declared you finished. Samurai who lived into old age practiced kata until they physically couldn't any longer. The training was lifelong because the skills required maintenance and because the discipline itself was the point. You weren't training to reach a destination. You were training because training was what samurai did. The code that governed samurai life had 7 principles, 7 virtues that were expected to be embodied at all times. These weren't suggestions or aspirations. They were requirements, woven so deeply into daily existence that separating them from ordinary actions became impossible. Righteousness, courage, compassion, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. Each virtue had specific meanings in the context of warrior life, meanings that often differed from how the same words were understood by other classes. Righteousness meant acting according to proper order even when it was difficult. Not what was easy, not what benefited you personally, but what aligned with the correct way things should be. If your lord made a decision that seemed wrong, righteousness meant trusting that his perspective encompassed factors you couldn't see. Your view was limited to your own experience. His view covered the welfare of the entire domain, considerations of politics and strategy that weren't visible from your position. Questioning his judgment wasn't righteousness, it was presumption. Courage extended beyond physical bravery in battle, though that was certainly included. Courage meant accepting whatever outcome came, including your own passing, without resistance or complaint. It meant enduring hardship silently, facing disgrace if disgrace served a larger purpose, maintaining composure when everything inside you wanted to break. Physical bravery was the minimum expectation. Mental courage, the willingness to sacrifice comfort, reputation, even your sense of self for duty, that separated true samurai from those who merely carried swords. Compassion seemed contradictory in a warrior culture, but it had specific application. Compassion meant ending an enemy's suffering efficiently rather than prolonging it. When you struck to complete the task cleanly. When a fellow samurai was injured beyond recovery, compassion was helping that person pass with dignity. It was mercy expressed through skill and precision. The better your technique, the more compassionate you could be. A clean cut that accomplished its purpose immediately was an act of compassion. Inefficiency that caused unnecessary suffering was cruelty. Respect governed every interaction, though its expression varied depending on who you were addressing. You respected superiors through absolute obedience and careful attention to protocol. You respected equals through proper language and acknowledgement of their position. You respected inferiors by fulfilling your obligations to guide and protect them appropriately. Even enemies deserved respect in the form of serious effort. Facing an enemy without full commitment was an insult that diminished both of you. Respect wasn't about feelings. You performed respect regardless of what you felt internally. Honesty meant your word was absolute. If you made a promise, you fulfilled it, or the effort to fulfill it ended you. If you made a statement, it was accurate, or you corrected it immediately. Deception was acceptable in warfare against enemies. That was considered strategy, but never with your lord, never with fellow samurai, never in matters that touched on honor. Your reputation for honesty was one of the few things that was truly yours. Once compromised, it could never be fully restored. Some samurai who were caught in deliberate lies chose to end their service rather than continue with diminished credibility. Honor sat at the center of everything. Your honor, your family's honor, your lord's honor, all bound together. A mark against your honor marked everyone connected to you. Your actions didn't belong to you alone. They reflected on your ancestors, affected your descendants, and impacted your lord's reputation. You carried the weight of multiple generations in every decision. One mistake, one moment of weakness, one failure of judgment could erase decades of accumulated respect. The pressure of this was constant, a weight that never lifted. Loyalty was the foundation beneath everything else. Your life belonged to your lord, not figuratively, literally. He could command your passing and you would comply without hesitation or question. He could order you to abandon your family, to ruin yourself financially, to undertake tasks that seemed impossible. Your feelings about these commands were irrelevant. Loyalty transcended personal preference, moral qualms, even survival instinct. When a lord passed, some samurai chose to follow in the same transition, ending their own service to demonstrate that loyalty extended beyond life itself. This practice, called junshi, was considered the ultimate expression of devotion. These 7 virtues sounded noble when recited in ceremonies. They sounded like ideals worth pursuing. But living them every day was different. They formed a structure made of expectations, and every action was judged against these standards. Your peers watched for weakness they might exploit to advance their own standing. Your superiors watched for failures they needed to address. Your inferiors watched for guidance they could follow. Even your family watched, knowing their fate was tied to your performance. The weight of constant evaluation was exhausting in ways that physical training never was. You could rest your body between sessions. You could never rest from judgment. There was no private space where the code didn't apply. Even alone in your room at night, you monitored yourself, examining your thoughts for disloyalty, your feelings for weakness, your desires for selfishness. The code had been internalized so thoroughly that you'd become your own strictest judge, evaluating yourself more harshly than any external observer would. There was a ritual practice that embodied the ultimate expression of these values. Seppuku, the formal ending of one's own life, was how samurai restored honor after serious failure or followed their lord in passing. The practice had existed for generations, refined over time into a ceremony with specific steps and protocols. Every samurai knew about it from childhood, had seen it performed at least once, and understood that circumstances might one day require performing it themselves. The possibility sat in the background constantly, a final option that was always available. The preparation for seppuku was elaborate and formal. First came a ritual bath, washing away the impurities accumulated through life. Then dressing in white robes, the color associated with purity and transition. The location was prepared carefully, usually a formal room with specific positioning of cushions and screens. Witnesses were selected based on rank and relationship. Everything was choreographed with precision because even this final act had to be performed correctly, according to established form. The person performing seppuku knelt in Caesar position on a white cushion. Before them was a small stand holding the wakizashi, wrapped partially to prevent the hand from sliding during use. Behind them stood the kaishakunin, the assistant, usually a trusted colleague or respected friend. This person's role was crucial. At the appropriate moment, they would deliver a final stroke to complete the ceremony and end suffering. This was considered an act of compassion and required precise timing and technique. The ritual involved specific words and acknowledgements. Sometimes a final poem was composed, following classical forms. Sometimes there were formal statements of fault or expressions of loyalty. Then came the moment itself. The blade was taken, positioned carefully, and used as the ritual prescribed. The kaishakunin waited for the right moment, then brought their sword down in a single, precise cut. The goal was to complete the stroke almost entirely, while leaving a small connection of tissue so the head didn't separate completely, which would be considered undignified. The timing and precision required made being kaishakunin a significant responsibility. Witnessing seppuku was something most samurai experienced at least once during their lives. The ceremonies were conducted with such calm formality that they seemed almost serene. The person performing the ritual maintained composure throughout, demonstrating mastery over fear and pain. The witnesses observed in silence, their faces showing no reaction. The entire proceeding had a quality of inevitability, as if this was simply another duty being fulfilled according to proper form. The blade used for this purpose sat at your side every day. Your wakizashi, the short sword, was maintained specifically with this possibility in mind among its other uses. You kept it sharp enough to function efficiently. You practiced drawing it smoothly, so there would be no hesitation or fumbling if the moment came. The familiarity with the weapon was meant to reduce any reluctance when circumstances required its use. If you were ordered to perform seppuku, or if situations made it the only way to maintain honor, you needed to be ready to execute the ritual correctly without delay. Some samurai lived their entire lives without facing this requirement. Others encountered situations multiple times due to the complexities of political service or the demands of absolute loyalty. You didn't know which category you'd fall into. You only knew that the possibility existed constantly, hovering in the background of every decision, every action, every word. One significant mistake could require it. One shift in political circumstances, one command from your lord. The tea ceremony was another expression of these values, though on the surface it seemed unrelated to warrior life. The practice was called chanoyu, the way of tea, and it was treated with the same seriousness as weapons training. You learned the precise movements, the proper handling of utensils, the correct way to prepare and serve tea. A full ceremony could take hours, and every gesture mattered. It was meditation disguised as hospitality, discipline expressed through aesthetic ritual. The preparation began with gathering the implements. Each item had its specific purpose and proper handling. The tea bowl, ceramic with a slightly rough texture that helped grip when the bowl was wet. The tea whisk, carved from a single piece of bamboo, split into dozens of thin prongs. The tea scoop, also bamboo, shaped specifically for measuring matcha powder. The water kettle, cast iron, heated over charcoal. Each item was placed in its designated position, creating an arrangement that was both functional and visually balanced. Water temperature was critical for proper tea preparation. Too hot, and the tea developed bitter flavors. Too cool, and it didn't mix properly, leaving clumps of powder. You learned to judge temperature by sound, by observing the size of bubbles forming on the water's surface, by the quality of steam rising from the kettle. The water was heated slowly over charcoal, allowing time for conversation or silent contemplation, depending on the occasion and the guests present. When the water reached proper temperature, you warmed the tea bowl by pouring hot water into it and swirling gently. This served multiple purposes. It heated the ceramic so the tea wouldn't cool immediately when prepared. It cleaned any dust from the bowl. It allowed you to check that the bowl had no cracks that might leak. After warming, the water was discarded and the bowl was wiped dry with a cloth folded in a specific way. Every action had its proper form. Then came the tea itself. Matcha powder, bright green and finely ground, was measured with the scoop. The amount varied depending on whether you were making thin tea or thick tea, but generally 2 scoops for thin, 3 for thick. The powder sat in the bottom of the bowl, waiting. You poured hot water over the powder, not too much, just enough to create the right consistency when mixed. The amount was judged by experience, learning over time how much water produced proper thickness. The whisking process required specific technique. The bamboo whisk was held at a particular angle, moved in a rapid M or W pattern, incorporating air into the mixture until it became frothy. The sound of whisking was rhythmic and steady. The foam that developed should be fine and even, covering the surface completely. Too little whisking left the tea thin and watery. Too much broke down the foam. The bowl was turned slightly before being offered, positioned so the front faced away from you. This was a gesture of humility, presenting the best view to the guest, rather than keeping it for yourself. The bowl was offered with both hands, a slight bow accompanying the gesture. The guest received it with both hands. bowed in acknowledgement, turned the bowl to avoid drinking from the front, and took 3.5 sips. Exactly 3.5, ending with a small audible slurp to show appreciation. Then the bowl was returned, wiped clean, and the process could begin again if there were multiple guests. The tea ceremony wasn't about the tea, though the tea was certainly consumed and appreciated. It was about presence, about attention, about cultivating awareness in every small action. It was training in mindfulness, in controlling your movements and thoughts simultaneously. A warrior needed to be capable of both explosive action and perfect stillness. The tea ceremony developed the stillness, the ability to move slowly and precisely, to focus completely on the immediate task, regardless of its apparent significance. You practiced the ceremony multiple times each week, sometimes with family, sometimes with other samurai, sometimes alone, going through the motions for the sake of maintaining skill. The ritual was soothing in its predictability. Unlike battle or politics where chaos and uncertainty dominated, the tea ceremony followed unchanging rules. You knew exactly what came next. The outcome was assured. This small island of certainty in an uncertain life provided a kind of respite, though you wouldn't describe it as relaxation. It was simply different from the usual tension, a focus that didn't involve the possibility of immediate physical danger. The summons to war came suddenly, even though tensions had been building for months. Border disputes with a neighbouring domain, disagreements over trade routes, old grudges between the lords that had festered for years. These conflicts could have been resolved through negotiation or marriage alliances, but neither side was willing to compromise. One morning, your lord assembled his samurai and informed everyone that diplomacy had failed. Preparation for battle would begin immediately. You had 3 days. The preparation was familiar from countless drills, but the weight of it was different when you knew the combat would be real. You inspected your armor carefully, examining each lacquered plate for cracks or weakness, testing the silk cords that bound the plates together, ensuring the helmet sat properly and didn't obstruct vision more than necessary. Armor was beautiful in its own way, decorated with your family's colors and crest, but it was primarily functional. The plates overlapped to allow movement while providing protection. The weight was distributed across your body through careful design, but it was still heavy, 40 to 60 pounds depending on the style and how many plates were included. You sharpened your swords, both katana and wakizashi, bringing each edge to maximum keenness. The process took time, using progressively finer stones to refine the edge until it could slice paper with minimal pressure. You had to avoid making the edge too thin, which would cause it to chip when striking bone, but sharp enough to cut efficiently. The balance was something you'd learned through years of practice. After sharpening came oiling to prevent rust, then checking all the fittings that held the blade in the handle, making sure nothing was loose or likely to fail under stress. Your bow required attention as well. The string was checked for fraying, any worn sections were replaced. The tension was tested to ensure it hadn't weakened. Arrows were inspected individually. Bent shafts were discarded because they'd fly unpredictably. Feathers were examined for damage that might affect flight. Each arrow that passed inspection received a small mark identifying it as yours, a practical measure in case any needed to be recovered after battle. Arrows were inspected individually. Bent shafts were discarded because they'd fly unpredictably. Feathers were examined for damage that might affect flight. Each arrow that passed inspection received a small mark identifying it as yours, a practical measure in case any needed to be recovered after battle. You prepared more arrows than you expected to use, knowing that some would be lost or damaged. The night before departure, sleep was difficult. Not from fear exactly, though fear was certainly present. More from the awareness that this might be your last night in this room, possibly your last night alive. You'd meditated on passing for years, visualized your own body still and lifeless countless times, but the immediacy of actual battle made those exercises feel abstract. Tomorrow the ending wouldn't be theoretical, it would be standing across from you with weapons drawn. The march to the battlefield took 2 days. You walked in formation with your unit, armor packed on horses or carts to preserve energy, weapons maintained carefully. The pace was measured, not rushed. Arriving exhausted before fighting even began served no purpose. You stopped at midday to rest and eat, then continued until evening. Nights were spent in temporary camps, guards posted at intervals, everyone sleeping in armor in case of surprise attack. The sleep was shallow and frequently interrupted, never restful. The battlefield, when you finally reached it, was an open plain between two hills. Your army took position on one side, the enemy on the other. Banners snapped in the wind, colors identifying different units and commanders. The sound of thousands of men preparing for combat created a low rumble, metal scraping against metal, voices calling orders, horses stamping and snorting. You put on your armor piece by piece, each plate tied in place, each cord pulled tight and secured. The helmet went on last, reducing your peripheral vision significantly but protecting your head. The world narrowed to what was directly in front of you. The initial engagement began with archery. Hundreds of arrows launched simultaneously, arcing high through the air before descending on the opposing force. You couldn't track individual arrows in flight. They became a dark cloud that whistled as it moved. Most arrows missed their targets. Some struck armor and deflected without causing harm. A few found gaps, and men began falling. You could hear the sounds of impact, the cries of those who were hit. Someone near you took an arrow through the throat and went down immediately. You stepped around him and maintained your position in formation. Your unit was ordered forward. You advanced at walking speed, maintaining formation as much as possible, shields raised where available. The noise increased as the distance closed. War cries, drums providing rhythm, horns signaling commands that were hard to distinguish in the chaos. Your heart was beating hard enough that you could feel it in your throat, but your breathing stayed controlled. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The training held even now, providing structure in a situation that felt unstructured and overwhelming. The armies met in confusion. Formation disintegrated almost immediately once contact was made. It wasn't organized combat. It was hundreds of individual fights happening simultaneously in close quarters. You found yourself facing an enemy samurai, his face hidden behind a mask similar to yours. He swung at you with his katana. You parried, the impact traveling up your arms and into your shoulders. You countered with a thrust aimed at the gap in his armor under his arm. He twisted away. Someone else crashed into you from the side. You nearly fell but caught yourself. The fighting was nothing like training. There was no space to move properly, no clear targets, no time to think through responses. You reacted on instinct and years of conditioning. Block, cut, move, block again. Your sword struck something solid, but you weren't sure if it was armor or flesh or wood from a spear shaft. Someone's blade scraped across your leg armor. You felt a sharp impact but no immediate pain. The noise was overwhelming, impossible to filter into useful information. You couldn't hear orders or coordinate with your unit. You were alone in a crowd of hundreds, fighting to survive one moment at a time. At some point, the pressure eased slightly. You realized the enemy was pulling back, not in organized retreat, but in gradual withdrawal. Your side was advancing, pressing them back. You followed because everyone else did, too tired to make independent decisions. The pursuit continued until your commanders called it off. The enemy had broken completely. This was victory, apparently, though it didn't feel like anything particular. Just an end to the immediate fighting. You stood in the aftermath, breathing heavily, looking around at what remained. Bodies were scattered across the field, dozens of them, possibly hundreds. Some were moving, wounded but alive. Others were still. The ground was churned mud mixed with blood and other things you didn't examine closely. The smell was copper and waste and something organic and terrible that you knew would stay in your nose for days. Someone near you was sitting down heavily, staring at nothing. Someone else was vomiting. You checked yourself for wounds and found a cut on your leg that had bled through your armor. Not deep, but it would need attention. The realization that you'd survived came slowly. Not relief or joy or pride, just acknowledgement. You were alive, many others weren't. That was the fact of the moment. The battle was over and you were still breathing. Everything else would need to be processed later, when your mind had capacity for more than immediate physical awareness. The procedures after battle began. Collecting wounded from both sides, treating injuries where possible, retrieving arrows that could be reused. stripping armor and weapons from those who no longer needed them. You participated mechanically, following orders, moving through tasks without conscious thought. Your mind felt separated from your body, watching from a distance as your hands performed actions you didn't choose. That night, in camp, there was celebration among some of those who'd fought. Sake was distributed, rationed carefully, but enough to dull the edges of what had happened. Men were drinking, talking, some boasting about their performance. You drank, but didn't talk. You sat quietly near the fire, watching the flames, replaying fragments of the battle in your mind. The enemy's face before contact, the weight of your sword meeting resistance, the sound of someone calling for help that didn't come. These memories had a strange quality, vivid but unreal, like something witnessed rather than experienced personally. You cleaned your sword carefully that evening, wiping away blood and mud, checking the edge for damage. The blade was intact, but would need proper sharpening when you returned home. Blood corroded steel if left too long, so thorough cleaning was essential even when you were exhausted. You oiled it thoroughly, returned it to its scabbard, and set it beside you. Your armor needed maintenance too, several cords cut during the fighting, one plate dented. Tomorrow's work. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and full of fractured dreams. You woke multiple times, heart racing, reaching for your sword before fully realizing where you were. The transition from battle alertness to normal rest didn't happen immediately. Your body was still primed for threat, scanning for danger even in sleep. This would continue for weeks after returning home. Sudden sounds would make you flinch. Shadows in peripheral vision would become enemies for a split second before your mind corrected the perception. This was normal for warriors. It passed eventually, or you adapted to it, or the distinction between the two became unclear. The return home from battle brought a different kind of challenge. War had clear purpose, defined objectives, moments of intensity followed by resolution. Peace offered no such structure. You woke each morning to the same routine, the same training, the same obligations, but the underlying tension never resolved. There was no climax in peacetime, no moment of release. Just endless maintenance of readiness for something that might or might not come again. Your days settled back into familiar patterns. Wake before dawn. Meditate on impermanence. Dress with careful attention to each layer. Eat in silence. Train for hours. The training continued exactly as it had before battle, perhaps more intensely because your lord wanted his samurai sharp and prepared. Kata practice, cutting exercises, archery, spear work. Your body went through motions it had performed thousands of times. The repetition was numbing in a way that became almost comfortable through sheer familiarity. The wound on your leg healed within weeks, leaving a thin scar you could feel when you knelt in Caesar position. Your body carried other marks now too. A permanent ache in your right shoulder from the impact of blocking strikes, stiffness in your lower back from hours spent in armor. These weren't significant injuries, nothing that prevented you from functioning normally, but they accumulated. You weren't yet 30, and already your body felt older than your years. This was normal for samurai. The physical demands extracted their price gradually, almost invisibly, until one day you realized movement that used to be effortless now required conscious effort. The morning routine after training involved maintenance tasks that had their own meditative quality. Your swords required daily attention even when not used in combat. You sat in your room with your cleaning kit laid out precisely, a soft cloth for wiping the blade, a small bottle of choji oil, rice paper for absorbing moisture, powder for final polishing. The arrangement never varied. You drew your katana and examined it in the morning light coming through the shoji screen. The blade caught the light at certain angles, revealing the hamon, the temper line where hard edge met softer spine. This line was unique to each sword, created during forging when the blade was differentially heated and quenched. You'd looked at this particular pattern so many times you could draw it from memory, every curve and wave as familiar as your own reflection. The blade showed no rust, no spots, no flaws. This was good and expected. Rust was a samurai's embarrassment, evidence of neglect. You took the cloth and began wiping the blade from base to tip, always moving away from your body, always following the same path. The motion was smooth and practiced, automatic. You were removing invisible moisture, oil from previous handling, microscopic particles that could eventually cause corrosion. The cloth made a soft whisper against the steel, a sound so quiet it was almost inaudible, but somehow satisfying. After wiping thoroughly, you applied a tiny amount of choji oil, spreading it evenly along the entire blade. The oil had a distinctive smell, slightly sweet from the clove mixed into it. Too much oil attracted dust and eventually caused problems. Too little left the steel vulnerable to moisture in the air, especially during humid summer months. You'd learned the correct amount through years of practice, developing an intuitive sense for how much was needed. The tsuka, the handle, needed inspection as well. You checked the ITO, the binding wrapped around it, for looseness or wear. The binding was silk, or sometimes cotton, wrapped in a specific diamond pattern over same ray skin that provided grip. Any looseness meant the binding might shift during use, affecting your grip. You made sure the menuki, the small ornaments under the binding, were secure. You verified that the blade was fitted tightly inside the handle, no movement between tang and wood. A loose blade in combat meant unreliable performance at best, catastrophic failure at worst. This maintenance ritual took perhaps 30 minutes each morning. The time could theoretically be shortened, but there was no reason to rush. The careful attention to detail was part of the discipline, as important as the maintenance itself. Your swords were not merely tools, they represented your soul, your status, your family lineage. Neglecting them would be like neglecting yourself. Some samurai spoke to their swords during cleaning, thanking them for service, promising to use them honorably. You didn't do this. The relationship didn't require words. The daily care was the conversation. After sword maintenance came calligraphy practice. You set up the writing table with the same care applied to sword cleaning. The inkstone was placed in its proper position. You added a few drops of water from a small container and began grinding the inkstick in slow, measured circles. The grinding motion was rhythmic and steady. The inkstick made a soft scraping sound against the stone's surface. You ground for several minutes, occasionally testing the consistency by dipping a finger in the pooling ink. When it reached the right thickness, neither too thin nor too thick, you prepared the brush. The brush was bamboo handled with animal hair bristles, worn soft and shaped from years of use. You dipped it in the ink, rolled it slightly against the stone's edge to form a proper point, then positioned yourself over the paper. Today's practice was copying a passage from the Hagakure, a text on samurai conduct. You'd copied this particular passage many times before, but repetition was the entire point. Each character had to be formed with proper stroke order, proper balance, proper spacing relative to the characters around it. The first stroke of the first character began. Your hand moved smoothly, the brush responding to subtle pressure changes. Thick lines where you pressed down, thin lines where you lifted slightly. The ink flowed onto paper, permanent and unforgiving. There was no erasing in calligraphy. An error meant starting over with fresh paper, which was expensive enough that waste was discouraged. You completed the first character and paused briefly, examining it. The balance was slightly off, the third stroke a fraction too long. You continued anyway. The goal wasn't perfection in a single character, but consistency and improvement across the entire piece. The passage took 20 minutes to complete. When finished, you set the brush aside on its rest and examined the work. Some characters were better than others. The overall piece was acceptable, but not exceptional. This was normal and expected. Mastery of calligraphy took decades of daily practice. You'd been practicing for 15 years and were still considered intermediate. The practice wasn't about reaching an endpoint. It was about the daily discipline of attempting precision in small things, maintaining focus, training your hand and eye to work together. The paper was left to dry while you prepared tea for yourself. Not a formal ceremony, just simple preparation for personal consumption. You heated water in a small kettle over charcoal, measured matcha powder into a bowl, poured the water when it reached proper temperature, whisked briefly until the tea was properly mixed and slightly frothy. The entire process took perhaps 5 minutes. You drank the tea slowly, sitting on the floor, looking at your calligraphy drying on the table. The tea was bitter and grassy, warming as it went down. The caffeine provided gentle alertness without agitation or nervousness. Midday brought obligations at the castle. Your lord required his samurai to attend him regularly, maintaining presence, being available for assignments, or simply demonstrating availability. You walked to the castle through streets that were busy with merchants, craftsmen, labourers going about their business. You passed through these crowds, but remained separate from them. Samurai didn't engage casually with lower classes. You maintained distance, dignity, awareness of the distinction between your world and theirs. The castle grounds were familiar territory. You entered through the samurai gate, a separate entrance from the one used by merchants or petitioners. You removed your sandals in the designated area, walked in clean tabby socks across polished wooden floors that showed their age and care in the depth of their shine. Other samurai were present, standing or kneeling in alcoves, waiting to be called for service, or simply demonstrating their availability. You took your position in your assigned area and settled in to wait. Waiting was a significant part of samurai life, perhaps more significant than the dramatic moments that stories focused on. You waited for orders, waited for assignments, waited for permission to speak or move or leave. The waiting had to be done properly. Upright posture, alert but calm expression, readiness without visible impatience. You could wait like this for hours if necessary, and often did. Some days you were called for specific duties, escorting officials, attending meetings, carrying messages. Other days you simply waited, were not needed, and returned home in the evening without having done anything of substance. Both outcomes were equally acceptable. Your role was to be available, ready to serve when required. Today, you were assigned to accompany a senior samurai on an inspection of border villages. This meant traveling, being away from home for several days. You returned home briefly to collect necessary items. A change of clothes, basic toiletries, some dried rice and pickled vegetables for travel rations. Everything fit in a small cloth bundle. Samurai travelled light by necessity and by philosophy. Excessive possessions suggested attachment, which was considered a weakness. You informed your family you'd be departing, received a slight nod of acknowledgement from your mother, then returned to the castle to join the inspection party. The inspection tour was routine, the kind of duty that consumed time without being particularly demanding or dangerous. You visited villages along the domain's border, observed conditions, confirmed that taxes were being collected properly, ensured that no unauthorized activities were occurring. The senior samurai you accompanied asked questions of village headmen, examined records, made notes. You stood nearby, alert for any problems, but nothing unusual occurred. The villages were poor but managing, their residents compliant and respectful in that careful way people adopted when dealing with authority that could punish them arbitrarily. Evenings during the inspection were spent in local inns or sometimes in the homes of wealthier villagers who were obligated to provide accommodation. The lodging was basic, clean, but sparse. You ate simple meals, usually rice with vegetables and occasionally fish. The senior samurai sometimes engaged in conversation during these meals, discussing domain politics or recent events, and you listened attentively, offering brief responses when directly addressed, but mostly maintaining respectful silence. After the meal, you performed your evening sword maintenance, then slept lightly on a thin futon, waking several times during the night from habit and from the unfamiliarity of the surroundings. The inspection lasted 5 days. When you returned home, nothing had changed. Your room was exactly as you'd left it. The household routine continued in its unchanging rhythm. You resumed your normal schedule of meditation, training, maintenance, waiting. The days blended together, each one almost identical to the one before and the one that would follow. This sameness was intentional, valued even. Unpredictability was dangerous. Routine provided structure and security. Marriage came eventually, arranged by your family in consultation with your lord. You were informed of the arrangement rather than consulted about it. The woman came from another samurai family, appropriate rank, acceptable lineage. You met her at the wedding ceremony itself, which was formal and brief. She was dressed elaborately, face painted white, expression carefully neutral. You exchanged ritual cups of sake, performed the prescribed bows and acknowledgements, and then she moved into your family's household. That was marriage. No courtship, no romance, no gradual building of relationship. Just a practical arrangement designed to create alliances and produce legitimate heirs. The relationship remained formal indefinitely. You saw your wife at meals, which were still eaten in silence. You saw her when you returned to your room in the evening. Conversation between you was minimal and practical. Schedules, household matters, eventually children. There was no expectation of emotional intimacy. Love between spouses was considered irrelevant at best, a distraction at worst. Marriage was duty. Affection, if it developed, was incidental. You performed your obligation to produce heirs. She performed her obligation to manage the household and raise children. Your involvement was minimal until sons reached the age to begin training around 5 years old. Then they became your responsibility. Their education in samurai weighs your duty. You taught them as you'd been taught, with discipline and distance, correcting errors without praise, building strength through repetition and endurance. You taught them as you'd been taught, with discipline and distance, correcting errors without praise, building strength through repetition and endurance. The cycle continued. Another generation learning to suppress emotion, to value duty over comfort, to accept that their lives were not their own. You taught them as you'd been taught, with discipline and distance, correcting errors without praise, building strength through repetition and endurance. Living under constant evaluation created a particular kind of exhaustion that had no relief. Physical tiredness could be addressed with rest. Mental tiredness from training could be eased by switching to different activities. But the tiredness that came from never being able to relax your guard, from always monitoring yourself and being monitored by others, that tiredness accumulated without clear solution. Your reputation was your life in a very literal sense. One significant scandal could erase everything your family had built over generations. The scandal didn't have to be criminal. It could be as simple as a public display of emotion that was deemed inappropriate, anger shown at the wrong time, grief expressed too openly. Even laughter in the wrong context could be noted and remarked upon, added to the mental ledger others kept of your character and reliability. Peers watched each other constantly, not from malice necessarily, but from the structure of the system. Advancement was limited. There were only so many positions of authority, only so many ways to gain favor with your lord. If another samurai made a mistake, reporting that mistake was an opportunity to demonstrate your own loyalty and attentiveness. This created an atmosphere where trust was difficult and friendships were complicated. You might train alongside someone for years, rely on them in battle, yet never fully trust them because circumstances could make them your rival at any moment. The paranoia wasn't clinical. It was rational response to real conditions. You did need to be careful about what you said and to whom. You did need to monitor your behavior constantly. The social environment genuinely was precarious. One moment of genuine vulnerability could be weaponized against you later. So you maintained your mask, your careful composure, your measured responses. You showed nothing that could be used, revealed nothing that could be exploited. This extended to family relationships as well. Your wife might report concerning behavior to her family, who might mention it to others. Your children, especially as they grew older, might inadvertently reveal something that reflected poorly on you. Even servants observed and remembered, and their loyalty could be purchased by others interested in information. The concept of privacy as moderns understand it didn't exist. Your life was visible, and the visible parts were constantly evaluated. Vendetta was another source of persistent tension. Blood feuds could span generations, passed down like heirlooms. Your grandfather might have insulted someone's honor decades ago, and now you were expected to uphold your family's position in that dispute, potentially escalating to violence. You might inherit enemies you'd never met, be required to harbor grudges about incidents that happened before you were born. The logic was collective. The family was the unit, not the individual. Wrongs against the family persisted until balanced through death or formal reconciliation, which was rare. These inherited feuds created complicated social dynamics. You might encounter the descendant of your family's rival at official functions. Both of you were required to maintain perfect courtesy and protocol, while knowing that outside formal settings, conflict between your families was expected and even required. The tension of maintaining this dual awareness, being formally polite while genuinely hostile, was mentally exhausting. The swords at your side were constant physical reminders of all this weight. They weren't just weapons, they were symbols of your status, your responsibilities, your potential end. Drawing your blade inappropriately was serious offense. Failing to defend your honor when challenged was equally serious. The swords existed in this paradox, always present, rarely used, but defining your existence completely. Social gatherings among samurai had a particular quality of performance. Everyone was evaluating everyone else while pretending not to. Conversations were carefully constructed, each statement considered for multiple meanings before being spoken. Silence was often safer than speech, but too much silence could be interpreted as aloofness or disdain, which had its own risks. You learned to speak in ways that communicated without revealing, to be present without being exposed. Alcohol helped, which is why it flowed relatively freely at certain gatherings. Sake loosened the constant vigilance slightly, allowed moments of something approaching genuine interaction. But even drunk, samurai maintained enough control to avoid truly dangerous revelations, and the next day, anything said while drinking could be held against you or dismissed as sake talking, depending on what served the listener's interests. So even the relief of drinking was complicated by calculation. The isolation this created was profound. You were surrounded by people constantly. Family, fellow samurai, servants, officials. Yet genuine connection was rare to the point of being almost impossible. The mask you wore wasn't removable because removing it was dangerous. Over time, the distinction between mask and face became unclear. The performance of being composed, dutiful, reliable, that performance became your actual personality. Or perhaps your actual personality was still there underneath, but inaccessible even to yourself. Some samurai developed what might now be recognized as depression, though that term didn't exist in that context. A flatness of affect, a sense of going through motions without connection to them, a persistent feeling that nothing mattered because everything was predetermined anyway. This wasn't considered illness. It was just part of some people's character. They continued to function, perform their duties, maintain proper appearance. The internal emptiness wasn't discussed because discussing internal states was inappropriate. Others developed a kind of rage that had no outlet. Anger at the constraints, at the constant evaluation, at the lack of agency in their own lives. This rage couldn't be expressed directly because that would be loss of control, which was shameful. So it was suppressed, held down, locked away. Sometimes it leaked out in permitted contexts. Harsh treatment of subordinates, excessive force during training, volunteering for dangerous assignments that offered legal opportunity for violence. The rage found channels that were socially acceptable, ways to express pressure without breaking protocol. The compound effect of all these pressures, the reputation management, the inherited feuds, the constant monitoring, the emotional suppression, the lack of genuine connection, it shaped everything. Your dreams at night were often about failure and shame, scenarios where you made some terrible mistake and brought disgrace on your family. Or worse, dreams where you were free of all constraints, which upon waking brought their own kind of shame for even imagining such freedom. The weight of the swords at your hip became metaphorical as well as literal. They represented duty, honor, the possibility of violence, the requirement to maintain face. Taking them off at night before sleep should have been relief, but even their absence was felt. You were never truly without them because they symbolized everything you were, everything you had to be. Morning came, and you put the swords on again, resuming the weight, and the day began exactly like the one before. Training, maintenance, waiting, performing. The mask in place, the guard up, the vigilance constant. This was life. This was what samurai meant. Not the dramatic moments of battle or ceremony, but the endless accumulation of disciplined days, each one exactly like the others, each one carrying the full weight of expectation and evaluation. Some nights you lay awake despite exhaustion, mind too active to settle, reviewing the day's interactions, analyzing whether you'd said or done anything that could be problematic, planning the next day's obligations, preparing responses to possible situations. The mind that had been trained to constant vigilance couldn't turn off simply because you wanted to sleep. It continued its watchful analysis, looking for threats, preparing defenses, never truly resting even when the body desperately needed rest. The quiet before dawn became familiar. That dark hour when you'd wake long before you needed to, unable to return to sleep, lying in the darkness with your thoughts. This was when the weight felt heaviest. In that silent darkness with nothing to distract you, the reality of your constrained existence sat on your chest like physical pressure. You couldn't name it, couldn't discuss it, could barely acknowledge it even to yourself. But you felt it. Every samurai felt it. The weight of duty, honor, expectation, evaluation, all of it pressing down in the darkness before dawn. And then dawn came, and you rose, and you began again. Meditation, preparation, maintenance, duty. The routine was the structure that made it bearable. Without the routine, without the precise expectations and ordered activities, the weight might become unbearable. But with the routine, you could function, you could continue. You could be what you were required to be, day after day after day, until eventually you couldn't distinguish between what you were required to be and what you actually were. The ritual for restoring honor after serious failure had existed for generations, refined over centuries into a ceremony with precise steps and expectations. Every samurai knew the procedure from childhood, had witnessed it at least once, and understood that circumstances might someday require participation, either as the one performing it or as the assistant who completed it. The possibility existed in the background always, a final option available when no other path remained. The preparation was elaborate and formal, treated with the same attention to detail as any important ceremony. First came purification through bathing, water heated specifically for this purpose, washing away the accumulation of daily life. After bathing, white robes were worn. White represented purity and transition, appropriate for this particular ceremony. The robes were simple, unadorned, without decoration or personal identification. The location was prepared with specific attention to arrangement. A formal room was selected, usually one with minimal decoration and good natural light. A white cushion was positioned in the center. The blade that would be used, the wakizashi, was placed on a small stand. Witnesses were selected based on rank and relationship. The kaishakunin, the assistant, was usually a trusted colleague. This person stood ready to complete the ceremony at the appropriate moment, a role that required skill, trust, and composure. The ceremony itself followed established protocol. Sometimes there were final words, formal acknowledgements about the reasons. Sometimes a poem was composed following classical forms. What didn't vary was the underlying structure, the progression of steps refined over generations. Everything proceeded according to proper form, witnessed in silence, completed with precision. The calm formality was considered important. Loss of composure by anyone present would be noted as failure to maintain proper demeanor. The reasons for performing this ritual varied, sometimes ordered by a lord, sometimes chosen voluntarily as the only way to restore honor. Sometimes an expression of ultimate loyalty, following a lord who had passed. The blade carried daily had multiple purposes, including this one. Battle offered a different path, generally considered preferable. Passing while fighting was called a good outcome. Facing forward, engaging the enemy, performing duty until you no longer could. The specific circumstances varied, but battle offered purpose and completion that aligned with samurai ideals. Capture was unthinkable. Surrender wasn't an option in the framework. Old age was perhaps most challenging. Growing old meant visible deterioration. You couldn't perform as you once had. Your value decreased as capabilities diminished. The cultural framework didn't celebrate old age the way some societies did. Physical decline was unfortunate reality that diminished status. Elderly samurai who had means sometimes retired formally, taking Buddhist vows. But even this meant leaving active participation while still alive, existing on margins of a world you no longer actively shaped. The relationship samurai had with mortality was complex. Fear existed, but was considered something to manage rather than eliminate. Daily meditation was meant to familiarize you with impermanence, so transition came with less shock. Buddhist beliefs about rebirth were common. This life was one of many. What you did now affected what came next, but the cycle continued regardless. Some took comfort in this framework. Others focused on present duty rather than future possibilities. The question of whether you could survive as samurai isn't really about physical capability. The more fundamental question is about psychological adaptation. Could you internalize constraints until they became your personality? Could you suppress natural responses until they stopped appearing? Could you accept that your life wasn't your own, that preferences were irrelevant, that duty superseded everything? The physical demands were significant. Training from age 5, building specific conditioning, skills taking decades to master. Modern bodies aren't prepared for sustained physical stress. But physical challenges could theoretically be adapted to given time. The psychological demands were in some ways more difficult because they required fundamental changes to how you understood yourself. The autonomy modern people take for granted wouldn't exist. Every decision about your life was determined by duty and hierarchy. Your preferences mattered only when they didn't conflict with obligations. This wasn't oppression in the sense of cruelty. It was societal structure. Everyone lived within similar constraints, just with different specific requirements. The emotional suppression would be extremely difficult for people raised in cultures encouraging expression. Modern frameworks emphasize acknowledging feelings, processing them, expressing them healthily. Samurai culture required the opposite. Show nothing externally except what's appropriate to your role. The gap between internal experience and external expression had to be maintained constantly. Over time, for many, internal experience itself diminished. It's difficult to continue feeling intensely when you can never express, and when expressing is genuinely dangerous. The lack of privacy would be jarring. Modern people have spaces where they can be alone, unobserved. Samurai had almost none. Walls were paper screens, sound carried. And beyond physical lack of privacy, there was cultural expectation that you were always representing family, lord, class. Even alone, you maintained discipline because discipline had to be absolute. Marriage structure would be difficult for people expecting emotional partnership. Modern marriages in many cultures are based on choice and compatibility. Samurai marriages were political arrangements. The relationship was formal and remained formal. Affection might develop or might not, but either way it wasn't the point. Marriage existed to produce heirs and maintain alliances. The relationship with violence would be particularly challenging. Modern society insulates people from direct physical violence. Many go entire lives without witnessing serious injury. Samurai lived with violence as constant presence. Training involved being struck, thrown. Battle meant witnessing and causing harm. Becoming desensitized was necessary for functioning, but desensitization had costs affecting how you related to everything. The isolation from genuine connection would perhaps be hardest. Humans need connection for psychological health, but samurai life made authentic connection extremely difficult. You couldn't be vulnerable because vulnerability could be exploited. You couldn't fully trust because circumstances could make anyone your rival. Even family relationships were formal and distant. The isolation was profound and persistent. The meaning crisis would emerge eventually. Your life wasn't your own. Your choices were made by others. Days followed prescribed patterns. What was the point if you were essentially a function being performed, a role being filled, with no space for personal expression? Some found meaning in duty itself, in perfect performance of role. Others struggled with the question throughout their lives. The compound effect of all these challenges would exceed most people's capacity to adapt, not quickly, not dramatically, but gradually. You'd function because you'd have no choice, but the functioning would be mechanical, hollow, disconnected from any sense of aliveness. The samurai who thrived were either exceptionally suited to demands or became something different from what modern people would recognize as psychologically healthy. They adapted by surrendering parts of themselves the system couldn't accommodate. Modern people looking at samurai culture often see the aesthetics, the swords, the armor, the ceremonies. These elements are genuinely beautiful in craftsmanship and design. But aesthetics existed within context of sustained difficulty, not usually emphasized in popular depictions. The beautiful sword was maintained through daily discipline that never stopped. The elegant ceremony was performed under psychological pressure that was constant. Honor was maintained through suppression of natural human needs for autonomy, connection, emotional expression. You wouldn't survive not because you're weak. Modern people aren't weak. They're adapted to different challenges. But adaptation required for samurai life is so fundamentally different that transition would be nearly impossible. You'd fight against your own psychological wiring, against cultural conditioning that taught you to value things samurai culture required you to suppress. The samurai themselves weren't superhuman. They were people adapting to the system they were born into. They didn't choose this life. They were born into it, shaped by it from childhood, given no alternative framework. For them, this was simply how life worked. The difficulty was normal. The constraints were reality. They endured because enduring was what you did. But even they carried the costs. Physical deterioration, emotional flatness, isolation, persistent tension. These affected everyone. Some carried it more gracefully, but everyone carried it. The question isn't whether samurai were stronger than modern people. The question is about compatibility between person and system, about whether adaptations are possible given who you are and how you were shaped. Most modern people would struggle enormously and likely not adapt successfully. They'd exist in persistent conflict between what they were trained to be and what this context demanded. The samurai didn't have that conflict because they weren't trained to be anything else. This was their reality from the beginning. They shaped themselves to fit because they had no experience of anything different. You're standing in a museum now. The gallery is quiet, temperature controlled, perfectly lit. Behind glass sits a suit of samurai armor. The lacquered plates catch the light, deep colors still vivid after centuries. Silk cords bind the plates together in patterns that are both functional and beautiful. The helmet curves upward, its shape both protective and aesthetic. The craftsmanship is remarkable. Hundreds of hours went into creating this armor, each plate shaped and lacquered by hand, each cord tied with precision. The swords rest nearby, displayed on stands. The katana's curve is elegant, the blade polished to mirror brightness. The smaller wakizashi sits beside it. Both weapons show the incredible skill of their makers, steel folded thousands of times, edges that could cut through bamboo with minimal effort. The art of sword making reached extraordinary heights in feudal Japan. These blades are masterpieces of metallurgy and design. The display card provides information. Dates, battles, the name of the samurai who wore this armor. The text describes his service, his loyalty, his honorable life. It mentions his training, his dedication to duty. The card presents the story cleanly, factually, preserving what can be known about a life lived centuries ago. But something is missing from the display. The armor is empty, beautiful, carefully preserved, but hollow. No one breathes inside it. The swords are clean, no memory of use visible on their polished surfaces. The display shows objects divorced from the context that created them. You see the craftsmanship, but not the weight. You see the beauty, but not the cost. The museum is silent except for footsteps on polished floors. Other visitors move past, pausing briefly at displays, reading cards, taking photos, moving on. The armor sits in its climate-controlled case, protected from humidity and temperature fluctuations that could damage the materials. Everything is preserved perfectly, frozen in a moment that never existed quite this cleanly. You look closer at the armor. The plates would have been heavy on the shoulders. The helmet would have restricted vision and hearing. In summer heat, wearing this would have been stifling. In winter cold, it would have provided minimal warmth. The beautiful cords that bind the plates together would have needed constant maintenance, replacement when they frayed, adjustment when they loosened. The armor was work, daily work, in addition to everything else. The swords too required constant attention, daily cleaning, regular sharpening, careful storage. They weren't decorations, they were tools that symbolized much more than their function. The weight of carrying them wasn't just physical, it was the weight of what they represented, who you were required to be because you carried them. The display card doesn't mention the meditation before dawn, the hours of training, the suppression of emotion, the arranged marriages, the isolation, the constant evaluation. It doesn't describe the physical pain that accumulated over decades, the psychological pressure that never lifted, the constraints that shaped every moment. These things don't preserve well. They don't sit behind glass and catch the light. They existed in bodies and minds, and when those were gone, they went with them. The armor is beautiful, genuinely, objectively beautiful. The workmanship deserves appreciation. The aesthetic tradition that shaped these objects has value and meaning. But the beauty existed in context of sustained difficulty. The discipline that maintained it was absolute. The cost of living within that discipline was paid daily by everyone in the system, in ways that are hard to capture in museum displays. You turn away from the case and walk toward the exit. Other exhibits wait, other preserved moments from other times. The museum does what museums do, preserving objects, providing information, creating spaces where people can look back at history from safe distance. The armor will remain behind glass, beautiful and empty, for decades more. Visitors will continue to pause, to admire, to photograph, to imagine. But imagining isn't living. The samurai didn't imagine this life. They lived it, day after day, year after year, carrying weight that the armor in museums can't convey. They woke before dawn and meditated on impermanence. They trained until their bodies broke down. They suppressed what they felt and showed what was required. They maintained honor through constant vigilance and discipline that never softened. They were people, not symbols. They adapted because they had to, because they were born into a system that shaped them from childhood. They endured what they endured because enduring was the only option. Some found meaning in duty, some struggled with emptiness. All of them carried weight that's invisible now, preserved only in written accounts, and in the understanding that systems like this extract costs from everyone within them. The museum doors open to modern streets. Cars pass, people walk with phones. Life continues in all its contemporary complexity. The distance between that world in the museum and this world outside is vast, measured not just in years, but in fundamental assumptions about what life should be, what humans need, what balance between duty and self is sustainable. The samurai armor sits behind glass, beautiful and empty. It always will be. That's what preservation means. The objects remain, the context fades, and what's left is aesthetic without the weight that originally gave it meaning. You can admire it, appreciate it, learn from it. But you can't truly know it, because knowing would require living it, and living it would require becoming someone fundamentally different from who you are. The armor doesn't breathe. It never did. And perhaps that was always the point.